Late 7th century. The main world trade artery of that time was the Great Silk Road, along which a variety of goods were delivered from Asia to Europe and back. Since colossal volumes of goods at that time were moved annually along the Silk Road, it ensured the enrichment of all nearby cities. It should be mentioned that due to the enormous length of the Silk Road, it was not safe to use it. Caravans along the Silk Road faced a huge number of difficulties and dangers, but the profits received from the sale of silk in Europe made the trade extremely profitable. The most difficult section of the Silk Road was Central Asia, which, due to the unfavorable climate, could only be crossed by moving between oasis cities. A significant part of these oasis cities until the end of the 7th century was under the control of the tribal confederation of the Turkish, which ensured the relative safety of caravans on their territory and, of course, received huge income. But this confederation plunged into the chaos of a civil war, which, of course, had a negative impact on the safety of trade caravans. And if the situation developed unfavorably, it threatened to disrupt trade relations between Europe and Asia. Since the Tang Empire was the main supplier of silk, it began to suffer serious losses due to instability in the Central Asian section of the Silk Road. To rectify the situation and renew the flow of silver and gold into the Tang Empire, Empress Wu Zetian decided to use military force to establish control over the oasis cities of Central Asia. For the sake of fairness, it should be mentioned that the Tang Empire needed control over Central Asia, not only to ensure the security of the trade route, but also to gain additional profit. Thus, control over a larger section of the Silk Road naturally provided additional income. Moreover, the Tang Empire, like any large state of that time, was always not averse to taking advantage of a favorable set of circumstances and expanding the territories under its control. Having assessed all the pros and cons, the Tang Empire began to take active action. In 692, the rapidly advancing army of the Tang Empire was able to establish control over the Tarim Basin, which previously belonged to the neighboring Tibetan Empire. Thus, under the control of the Tang Empire, the section of the Silk Road passing through the Tarim Basin was crossed, which allowed the army of the Tang Empire to continue its advance into Central Asia. Very soon, Fergana and the surrounding territories came under the rule of the Tang Empire, and the local population was forced to recognize the authority of the emperor. Thus, the Tang Empire was able not only to ensure the safety of trade caravans, but also, thanks to control over oasis cities, to obtain a source of additional income. However, the period of instability in the Turkish Confederation attracted the attention of not only the Tang Empire, but also the Umayyad Caliphate. The fact is that the Umayyad Caliphate, which was rapidly gaining strength, tried with all its might to expand its possessions, and control over the Silk Road would allow the Umayyads to receive an additional source of income that could be used to strengthen their own army and finance new conquests. In 705, the army of the Umayyad Caliphate, commanded by Qutayba ibn Muslim, invaded the territory of the Turkish Confederation and began a military campaign to establish control over the oasis cities. Since the Turkish could not provide serious resistance to the Arab army, the Umayyads soon managed to establish control over important cities located on the Silk Road, Bukhara and Samarkand. Knowing full well that if nothing is done, then soon the entire territory of the Turkish Confederation will be divided between the Tang Empires and the Umayyad Caliphate. The local Kagan Suluk concentrated all his efforts on uniting the warring Turkish tribes, hoping that by restoring the Turkish Confederation, he could stop the advance of the Tang Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate. However, Suluk's efforts were not crowned with success, since the forces were not equal, and the resistance of the Turkish, who stood under his banner, could only slow down the absorption of the territory of the Turkish Confederation by the Tang Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate. Since the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tang Empire soon had a common border, confrontation between the two states was inevitable. The fact that immediately after the Umayyad Caliphate had an enemy in the Tang Empire It also had a strong ally in the Tibetan Empire, deserves special mention. The fact is that the Tibetan Empire could not come to terms with the loss of the Tarim Basin, but its own forces were clearly not enough to regain control over it. Therefore, the Tibetan Empire entered into an alliance with the Umayyad Caliphate in order to jointly oust the Tang Empire from Central Asia. In 715, the armies of the Tibetan Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate invaded the Fergana Valley and, without encountering serious resistance, reached the outskirts of the city of Fergana, after which they began siege operations. Realizing full well that the fall of the city was inevitable, its ruler, Ikshid, fled to the territory of the Tang Empire to ask for help from the emperor. Soon, troops of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tibetan Empire occupied Fergana and appointed Alatur, loyal to themselves, as ruler of the city. Since the Tang Empire did not plan to put up with the loss of control over an important city on the Silk Road, very soon a 10,000-strong imperial army invaded the Fergana Valley. By this time, the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tibetan Empire had left the valley, so the army of the Tang Empire, without encountering serious resistance, was able to establish control over Fergana, which allowed Ikshid to once again become the ruler of the city and surrounding areas. Having learned that the Tang Empire had regained control of Fergana, the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tibetan Empire decided to immediately take active action. Knowing that the Tang Empire's 10,000-strong army was still in the vicinity of Fergana, the allies decided to strike elsewhere. They planned to jointly establish control over the Tarim Basin and thereby cut off the supply routes for the army of the Tang Empire and force it to leave Central Asia. In 717, when all preparations were completed, the allies began active operations. Detachments of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tibetan Empire invaded the Tarim Basin, which was under the control of the Tang Empire, and without encountering serious resistance, reached the outskirts of the city of Aksu. Due to the fact that the city was well defended and the local garrison did not plan to surrender, the allies were unable to take it by storm. Therefore, they had to begin siege work. Having learned about the invasion of its territory, the army of the Tang Empire hastily moved to the aid of the garrison of the city of Aksu. While the allies concentrated on carrying out siege operations, the army of the Tang Empire arrived in the vicinity of the city of Aksu. Unfortunately, there is no data on the size of the opposing armies, but one way or another, in the battle that broke out, victory was on the side of the Tang Empire, and the defeated troops of the Umayyads and the Tibetan Empire were forced to retreat to their territory. It should be mentioned that back in 715, Suluk, who understood perfectly well that he simply could not fight on two fronts, asked the Tang Emperor to recognize him as Khagan, in exchange for which he would recognize vassalage to the Tang Empire. But the emperor refused and offered him a high position in his army. It was not possible to reach an agreement, and since Suluk wanted to maintain at least partial independence of his lands, he was forced to fight both the Umayyad Caliphate and the Tang Empire. However, he was unable to effectively resist two powerful opponents. Despite this, Suluk did not plan to give up, trying to regain control of the oasis cities, but he died without achieving his desired goal. In 747, the Tang general Gao Xianji, who had previously successfully fought against the Tibetan Empire in the Pamir Mountains, established control over the Gilgit region, after which he concentrated on consolidating the empire's power in new territories. Thus, the Tang Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate divided the oasis cities between themselves, and since both sides did not plan to start a full-scale military confrontation, peace was established between them. The fact is that the oasis cities occupied by the Tang Empire were connected to its main territories by a narrow passage, which did not allow the rapid transfer of large forces, as well as the provision of supplies to a large army in Central Asia. As for the Umayyad Caliphate, in 747, a civil war began on its territory, which went down in history as the Abbasid Revolution. Thus, due to the fact that a fierce struggle for power began in the Arab Caliphate, the Arabs had no time to think about expanding the territories under their control. It is important to mention that, for unknown reasons, The Tang Empire did not take advantage of the period of instability in the Arab Caliphate to establish control over all the oasis cities. Only in 750, when the Abbasid dynasty came to power in the Arab Caliphate as a result of the civil war, a new conflict with the Tang Empire began. It is difficult to say why the Tang Empire did not take advantage of the favorable situation, but most likely the emperor simply did not plan to continue expansion to the west since he had enough other problems both within the state and with his neighbors in the north and south. However, regardless of the emperor's plans, a new military confrontation began between the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang Empire. According to available data, the reason for the start of a new war was not the desire of one of the parties to expand the territories under their control, but the conflict between the two oasis cities of Tashkent and Fergana. It is not known what exactly the rulers of these cities did not divide, but since they did not have enough of their own forces to fight their opponents, they turned to their patrons for help. General Gao Xianji immediately responded to the request of a vassal of the Tang Empire and, at the head of a small army, besieged Tashkent, which was under the rule of the Abbasid Caliphate. Since General Gao Xianji had siege engines at his disposal, his army was able to capture Tashkent as a result of a swift assault. Nevertheless, the ruler of the city managed to escape in time and turned for help to the commander of the Abbasid troops in the region, Ziyad ibn Saleh, who began hastily gathering forces to regain control of Tashkent. In turn, Gao Xianji understood perfectly well that after the capture of Tashkent, a large-scale military confrontation with the Abbasid Caliphate could not be avoided, so he also began preparations for the upcoming battle. The problem was that Gao Xianji only had a small army at his disposal, and it took a long time for reinforcements from the Tang Empire to arrive. In this situation, he was forced to replenish his army with mercenaries from the Karluk tribe, which ultimately became his fatal mistake. In 751, the Arab army under the command of Ziyad ibn Saleh invaded the territory of the Tang Empire and rapidly advanced without encountering serious resistance, until in July 751, on the banks of the Talas River near the city of the same name, it collided with the army of the Tang Empire under the command of Gao Xianji. The opposing armies lined up opposite each other, forming a battle formation. Unfortunately, there is no exact data on the number of opposing armies, but most historians agree that the balance of forces before the start of the battle looked like this. Under the command of Ziyad ibn Saleh, there were about 20,000 horsemen and 20,000 infantry. In the center, he placed his archers, behind whom were infantry armed with shields and spears. On the flanks of the Arab army, there were detachments of light and heavy cavalry, among which, in addition to warriors from the Abbasid Caliphate, there were also mercenaries from the Karluk tribe. Under the command of Gao Xianji, there were 10,000 well-trained and armed spearmen and crossbowmen from the Tang Empire, as well as about 20,000 lightly armed horsemen from the Karluk tribe. The infantry and crossbowmen of the Tang Empire formed the center of the army, and mercenary horsemen were located on the flanks. They were supposed to cover the flanks of the infantry of the Tang Empire, and at the right moment try to encircle the enemy. The Abbasid army had a numerical advantage, but the Tang army had technical superiority, so Gao Xianji ordered his crossbowmen to begin firing at the enemy. Soon a skirmish ensued between the crossbowmen of the Tang Empire and the Abbasid archers. The advantage, as expected, turned out to be on the side of the crossbowmen of the Tang Empire, because of which the Abbasid archers suffered huge losses and were soon forced to retreat under the protection of the shields of their infantry. After the retreat of the enemy archers, the crossbowmen of the Tang Empire began shelling the Abbasid infantry, which also began to suffer losses. Having assessed the situation on the battlefield, Ziyad ibn Saleh ordered his infantry to launch an offensive. Under a hail of arrows, the Abbasid infantry went on the attack, and as soon as it began to approach the crossbowmen of the Tang Empire, they retreated and let their infantry go ahead. The Tang Empire's spearmen launched a counterattack, and very soon they were engaged in battle with the Abbasid infantry. A bloody hand-to-hand fight ensued, and despite the fact that the Abbasid infantry had a numerical advantage, it was unable to overthrow the enemy. The fact is that the infantry of the Tang Empire was better armed and trained, so despite the fact that Gao Xianji's spearmen were in the minority, they soon began to push back the enemy. Noticing that the battle was turning in his favor, Gao Xianji ordered the Kurluk horsemen to launch an attack to encircle the Abbasid infantry, which was slowly retreating under the pressure of the Tang spearmen. In turn, Ziad ibn Saleh, seeing that the enemy's cavalry had begun an offensive, ordered his cavalry to immediately advance to meet it. Thanks to a timely order given, the Karluk cavalry was unable to carry out the planned maneuver and attack the enemy's flank, as it was met by an attack by the Abbasid cavalry. After the cavalry entered the battle, a bloody battle broke out with renewed vigor. At the same time, the situation on the battlefield was ambiguous. The infantry of the Tang Empire slowly pushed back the enemy infantry, but at the same time, detachments of heavy and light cavalry of the Abbasids began to slowly push back the Karluk cavalry. What happened next is unknown, but most historians agree that since the battle did not reveal a clear winner, both armies were ordered to return to their original positions. As for further events, the opinions of historians are also divided. Some historians claim that the battle continued for the next 2 days, according to the pattern described above, while others say that for 2 days the armies stood opposite each other and were inactive. How it was actually unknown, but on the third day, Gao Xianji ordered his infantry and crossbowmen to begin the attack again. Soon, the crossbowmen of the Tang Empire began a shootout with enemy archers. Since the advantage in the firefight was expected to be on the side of the Tang Empire, Ziad ibn Saleh ordered his infantry to launch an offensive. Observing the movement of the enemy infantry, the spearmen of the Tang Empire prepared for battle, but at that time the unexpected happened. The Karluk cavalry located on the flanks unexpectedly attacked the rear and flanks of the infantry of the Tang Empire. Since no one expected such a turn of events, the infantry of the Tang Empire suffered serious losses, but still managed to lead the onslaught of the Karluk cavalry. Soon the infantry of the Tang Empire, which had not yet managed to stabilize the situation, was attacked by the infantry and cavalry of the Abbasids. Thus she found herself surrounded by an enemy who had an overwhelming numerical advantage. For the sake of fairness, it should be mentioned that some historians adhere to the version that the Karluks did not betray the Tang Empire, but simply that the Abbasids also hired cavalry units from the Karluk tribe, which were in ambush for a long time and at the right moment unexpectedly entered into battle. This version is unlikely, since several detachments of light cavalry simply could not radically change the balance of power on the battlefield. The infantry of the Tang Empire fought fiercely, trying with all their might to maintain battle formations, but despite this, its ranks melted under the onslaught of a numerically superior enemy. Realizing that the battle was lost, Gao Xianji ordered the remnants of his army to hastily retreat from the battle. Having won a victory against the army of the Tang Empire under the command of Gao Xianji, the Abbasid Caliphate was able to regain control of Tashkent and also take advantage of the favorable situation to capture Fergana in the surrounding territories. However, the Abbasids did not dare to continue their offensive deep into the Tang Empire in order to establish control over other oasis cities. As for the Tang Empire, it made no further attempts to establish control over Central Asia. The fact is that the army of the Tang Empire was busy suppressing uprisings on its own territory, as well as fighting the Tibetan Empire. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.